to our first session. We're glad to have you here. We're going to go ahead and get started. So today we'll be focusing our time on how we will be planning for providing all students with access to accelerated learning. And before we dive into our learning for today, we're going to spend a few minutes connecting and orienting to how we'll be spending our time together this afternoon. One housekeeping note. So the note catcher that I was mentioning earlier, that's available for you to capture any notes, ideas, or planning that you get done in today's session. And we've been told that some schools will be providing PD hours or credits for attending these sessions. So by holding on to the handout and completing it today, that's a great way to show that you attended in the case that you will be able to receive some sort of hours or credit for your attendance. And just really quickly, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Irene Teskey, and I'm based in the Bay Area, and I'm a senior manager here at TNTP. My background is in multilingual learner education, and I'm joined by all the lovely people you see here on your screen. I will be co-facilitating with my colleague, Thelma, today. Thelma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. So glad to be with you today. My name is Thelma Perry. I'm also a senior manager here at TNTP, and I'm coming to you from Memphis, Tennessee. Enjoy. I'll send it back to you, Irene.
Thanks, Thelma. All right, so here are a few norms for us that we'd like to follow today just to make sure we're having a meaningful, collaborative learning experience for all participants. So I'd like to give you all just a second to read those norms in yellow to yourself. So just to highlight a few, we have joy and humor. So let's be sure to take some time today to feel joyful about the important work that we're going to be doing together today as educators, and this opportunity to learn something with your brilliant colleagues that you have joining you today. We also have up there, know better, do better. So at different points in our work today, we'll be sharing and reflecting on things that this past year maybe could have gone better, barriers that existed, changes that we would have liked to have made. And this is not really a time to dwell or get stuck in those events, but really rather an opportunity to share and receive feedback from your colleagues on how we can do better by all our students this coming year. Now we also have a few virtual norms. We ask that you try to be on video as much as you can, but of course, engage in the way that you are most comfortable. We ask also that you remain on mute. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat. When we go into breakout groups, we'll have more time to come off mute and discuss and engage with one another. If you find that you need to take a break, please try not to do so during our breakout groups, because that's really the time where we get to apply our learning together. And then one other note, if you have a private concern or want to send a direct message, please reach out to my colleague, Margaret Bruce, also from TNTP, with any questions, and she'll be able to respond to you very quickly. Finally, when you see these two icons, you'll see the orange one means that whatever's on your slide, you can also find in the handout. And then the speaking bubbles means we're going to be going into breakout groups soon. And I'm going to pass it over to Thelma to tell us a little bit more about TNTP.
Thank you, Irene. Very quickly, I wanted to give you all some background information on TNTP, just in case you weren't familiar with our organization. We were founded in 1997 by a group of teachers who believed that all students deserve great teaching with a particular focus on equity for students who have been historically underserved. Today, our focus is on three big areas: rigorous academics, talented people, and supportive environments. We offer a range of support, from strategic advice to multi-year execution with school districts, charter networks, and state departments of education just like this. TNTP and DESE have partnered in several initiatives in the past, including the Teacher Diversification Program and the Deeper Learning Series. Although this year is not like any other typical year in many ways, we are not completely asking you to reinvent the wheel. The learning acceleration approach will bring supporting students into grade level instruction. It will also help you support the well-being of your students. So please remember, many of the things that you hear here today, things that you discuss, and things that you do will be things that you've already done, perhaps in some shape, form, or fashion, or things that you've seen done, or things that you've been meaning to do, but you just haven't prioritized yet. Remember, the acceleration roadmap comes in two different editions. We have the teacher edition and we have the leader edition. It was designed to be focused and phased so that we could support students during the 21-22 school year. This is a year that will lay the foundation for accelerated learning for years to come. The roadmaps are designed just like any other normal school year in terms of phases. Just like any year, we start off with diagnosing and planning our current reality. Then we go into launching the year. And then, of course, we monitor our progress along the way. And lastly, we reflect on our successes and our achievements. So this year, we'll be alongside you in the planning phase, and we will help you to prioritize what's most important to your students in your schools, in your classrooms, so that we can make accelerated learning a reality. I want you to know that the roadmaps were developed from voices from educators, school and district leaders, students, and community members from across the Commonwealth. Their insight and their perspectives of these stakeholders was essential to developing these roadmaps. They also were essential voices in helping us to develop the learning experiences that we will be offering this summer. TNTP and DESE collaborated very closely to ensure that the existing resources and tools that are currently being used are aligned to the unique needs of the students across the Commonwealth. So, just a reminder, if you attended or watched one of the previous recordings of the webinar, which introduced the roadmaps, then you will most likely remember that the roadmaps are organized in three overarching priorities. These priorities are grounded in research that we know supports learning acceleration for students, and they were developed with extensive stakeholder feedback. We want to reiterate, they were developed with extensive stakeholder feedback. The guidance in each priority is designed to create equitable experiences and equitable outcomes for all of your students. And it's done in a manner which affirms race, identity, home language, and unique abilities. Most likely you've heard that accelerated learning is primarily about intentionally planning for just-in-time instruction and scaffolds. Yep, that's true. But I also like to add that throughout this series, you will hear us use the words accelerated learning. And by that, we mean that we're acknowledging the importance of attending to each of these three priorities to effectively accelerate learning. In other words, in order to employ accelerated learning well, teachers have to do these things: have strong and responsive relationships, know their students well, and use what you know to plan with intentionality and specificity. I'm sorry for the delay. Today, we're going to look at our overarching goals. These goals today are to, one, understand why we must provide accelerated learning to all students. We want to also develop an understanding of why and how we can plan for equitable systems and structures. We want to attend to the needs of our most vulnerable students. And lastly, you will get a chance to do some planning today. So please pause now for a silent solo moment and read the session objectives to yourself. We want to acknowledge that these priorities in this roadmap cannot be accomplished all at once, nor can they be accomplished in a short amount of time. The changes that you are going to decide to make will require strategic planning and management. So throughout this session, we will be asking you to reflect on how you will manage some of these changes that will create conditions for you to equitably ensure that all of your students receive accelerated learning experiences this upcoming school year. If you have any burning questions at this time, please make sure that you post those in the chat box. So let's go ahead and start with our first objective, and let's take a look at unpacking why and how this approach to accelerated learning is beneficial to all students.
Great, thank you, Thelma. Thank you, Thelma. So just as Thelma's just shared, we're going to take a look at why we are accelerating rather than remediating student learning in the first place. So what I'd like to ask you to do right now is just quickly in the chat, share 1 or 2 words you associate with accelerated learning. Thanks for kicking us off. Allison, high expectations, just in time. We're hearing that phrase a lot. Leveling the playing field, equity, grade level work. Yes, very important. Excellent. What I'm very glad to see here is not a lot of emphasis on going fast, because as you read in your pre-work, acceleration is not about going through the curriculum at a faster pace. It's about providing students that just-in-time instruction that's going to scaffold them into grade level work. So in other words, if a student hasn't mastered the earlier skills that are required to complete a grade appropriate assignment, the student then receives just-in-time support, giving them just the right amount of help to move forward right when they need that help through scaffolds and other coordinated supports. Remediation, on the other hand, is putting students in below grade level content to fill in all the previous gaps in a way that is really less intentional at moving a student quickly into grade level content. So the typical approach to remediation, usually providing work better suited for earlier grades, really won't come close to catching students up and will likely compound the problem. So in TNTP's recent study, The Opportunity Myth, we found that this approach of remediation, while often very well-intentioned, it practically guarantees that students will lose more academic ground. And it also reinforces the misguided belief that some students can't do grade level work. So the students who are stuck in this vicious cycle are, as we unfortunately know, disproportionately our most vulnerable students. Students of color, from low-income families, students with special needs, or those who are learning English. So in other words, doubling down on current strategies for catching students up will really only widen the opportunity and achievement gaps that we're seeing. So let's unpack this concept a little bit more by looking at what we learned from the opportunity myth. So even before school closures, we know that students often didn't have access to grade level assignments, especially students of color, students with disabilities, or those learning English. When we conducted the research in the opportunity myth, we looked at more than 5,000 assignments and 20,000 pieces of student work across 5 districts in the country. And we saw that students often were not even provided the opportunity to attempt, let alone have access to grade level tasks. In fact, only about a quarter of the assignments gave students the chance to meet the demands of the grade level standards in the 5 districts that we looked at. However, our study did show us something promising, and that's that students who received more frequent access to grade level content made significantly larger gains than their peers who did not. Specifically, 1.7 more months of academic progress for all students and 7.3 months for students who were the furthest behind. So why is that? To answer that question, we can look at TNTP's more recent study on accelerating learning versus remediating, specifically in elementary math. So in our newest research paper, released in partnership with Zern, we focus on the efficacy of these two approaches, remediation and acceleration. And we looked to see what we could uncover about how to most efficiently and equitably support unfinished learning for all students. And in the study, which you can find on our website, we found that students who are academically behind their peers benefit tremendously from accelerated learning practices as a way of accessing grade level work. What we also found reaffirmed our findings in the opportunity myth around which students do and do not receive opportunities to succeed in grade level work. So here we find, as you see here, that students in schools that are high poverty schools with majority Black, Latinx, and American Indian student populations are significantly more likely to be remediated than their white, wealthier counterparts, even when their level of struggle is identical. So again, students in lower income, non-white majority classrooms are more likely to be heavily remediated than white high income counterparts, despite similar levels of readiness. With that said, when students who traditionally receive remediation were provided with accelerated learning, they mastered nearly 50% more grade level lessons than remediated classrooms. We also found that students who experienced learning acceleration struggled less and learned more than students who started at the same level, but experienced a remediation approach instead. Part of the reason for this is that with just-in-time instruction, students are receiving instruction that is tailored to only address what is necessary to master the grade level content that's being focused on in that moment. So in other words, their learning is contextualized and instructional time is used much more efficiently and intentionally. So we know that all students need access to and benefit from learning acceleration. However, we also know that students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, students with mild to moderate disabilities, and English learners have less access than their peers to this approach. So committing to providing an accelerated approach to learning for all students is just one way we believe here at TNTP that we can approach rectifying some of the systemic inequities that have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Schools really need to be ready that first day back with a fundamentally different strategy for diagnosing unfinished learning and also preparing students to access grade level learning. So TNTP refers to this kind of work as the non-negotiable work of providing critical resources. Resources being things like strong instruction, grade level assignments, deep engagement to all students. So let's take a look at this quote here on the non-negotiable work. Thelma, can I ask you to come off mute and read the quote to the group, please?
Absolutely. Let me get my screen full. The root causes of inequitable allocation of resources are complex. There's no quick fix, but identifying and then actively working to dismantle structures that privilege already advantaged groups of students at the expense of their peers is non-negotiable work.
Thank you. So I'd like for you all to take a moment and reflecting on the quote, think about these two questions. What might the non-negotiable work look like specifically for you in your role? And how do you hold yourself accountable to doing this non-negotiable work? So take a moment to reflect, and as you're ready, please share your responses in the chat. So again, we're thinking about this commitment to providing accelerated learning to all students, thinking of it as our non-negotiable work. And what does that mean for you? Thanks, Jennifer, for kicking us off. Frequent assessments, great. Strong instruction, evidence-based practices, walkthroughs, so a lot of monitoring, great, and great responses here. Great, ensuring tier 1 instruction is strong. Yes, for all students, absolutely. These are wonderful responses about how we can commit and what this non-negotiable work looks for us in all of our different roles. I'd encourage you, if you haven't had a chance, if you were responding yourself, to go back into that chat and take a look at what this type of work is looking like for your colleagues here on our call today. So part of doing this non-negotiable work, as you all have pointed out, is that we have to have this plan for equitably accelerating learning for all students. And to create schools that are inclusive and work for all, we have to start from shared mindsets amongst educators about what students can achieve, and also develop the critical skills necessary to meet the unique needs of all students. When we say all students, we're of course not looking for a one-size-fits-all approach. So first, we need to begin by identifying the current mindsets and skill gaps that are creating barriers to equity that must be dismantled. So in this next section, we'll be taking a close look at two specific groups of students, just for today's purposes. So first, students with learning and thinking differences, which is a term that we use to include students who've been identified with diagnosed disabilities and those who are undiagnosed, as well as taking a look at how this focus on mindsets and skills means for supporting English learners. So a common mindset that impacts students with learning and thinking differences is this idea of the mythical average student to whom we can aim our practices at. So in other words, what works for them, this mythical average, should work for all or most, is the belief. However, as I just shared and we saw, we have seen that by not attending to students with diverse learning needs, we're creating barriers to learning and privileging already advantaged groups of students at the expense of their peers. So the person you see on your screen, Shelley Moore, is a Canadian researcher and educator who's devoted her work to focusing on increasing inclusivity for children in education. And she has a series of quick learning videos, one that we're going to take a look at, where she uses the analogy of bowling to connect to the mythical average student concept and explain why it is so problematic. So as you listen to the video, I'd like you to consider the questions on the slide, which we'll then discuss in small groups. So how do the ideas expressed in this video challenge or expand the way you see education? And also, what are the potential consequences if students with various learning needs are not planned for from the outset? So right now, I'm going to actually ask my colleague to chat the video link to you. This will support us with not getting any tech problems, hopefully. So let's see. So if you can chat, we're going to chat to you the YouTube video link to watch on your own. And then we'll come back together in about 3 minutes. So Margaret has shared the video. Feel free to go off camera as you watch, and we'll return in about 3 minutes. Our group.
Irene, we keep getting thrown out of our breakout room.
Yes, I'm sorry about that technical difficulty. I'm not exactly sure why we're being bounced in and out, but for the sake of time, I think we're gonna go ahead and just share a little bit out in the chat, your reactions to the video. I'm already seeing that some people have seen it before, are using it to talk about similar topics like UDL and why we need to be providing access to all students. So if you could take a moment and just share some of your reflections in the chat for the benefit of the group, we'd appreciate that. Thanks, Joe. We appreciate that. Great. Some of the trends that I'm seeing here is that this is a clear explanation of what we really mean when we're saying all means all, and thinking about our most vulnerable students as not an afterthought, not what am I going to do to shoot down the middle, and then how will I get these other groups of students' needs met, but really thinking about starting with the students whose needs tend to be pushed to the margin. So I'm glad I'm seeing that this video has resonated with you all. And I think, we're going to return as we go on to this question and this idea of what are the potential consequences if we do not begin this way. So thank you all for engaging in that. So we're going to stay with Shelley's analogy for a minute of the two pins that are standing. And we're going to think of these pins as our students. And next we're going to reduce 2 out of 10 to 1 out of 5. And we're going to pull that student from the margins into the front of focus. So this visual that you see, it represents the bedrock research for this work about the 1 in 5. So the National Center for Learning Disabilities found that 1 in 5 people actually learn and think differently. And before we unpack more about what that means, I want to make a clear distinction. So sure, it's fair to say that we are all different when it comes to how we think and learn. But research shows that 1 in 5 people are so different in terms of how they process information that their lives are uniquely more challenging as they try to navigate and compensate and succeed in a world that's really been designed for the 4 in 5. So when we are saying learning and thinking differences, part of this is about natural learner variability, not just a diagnosed disability. So thinking about the number of students in your school and how many students this might address, think about how many students this might equal for you in your school setting. And I'd also like you to pause and consider not just the number, but also when you hear the average student, who are you typically envisioning? And on the same train of thought, how is that shifting, or how might that need to shift? So we've discussed a little bit about mindsets as one barrier. And now we're going to discuss a little bit more about skill sets. So general educators will tell you themselves that they're not prepared to ensure that the 1 in 5 will thrive. So even though most students with learning and thinking differences spend most of their time in the general ed setting, only 63% of educators recall receiving any training on students with disabilities or learning and thinking differences. And only 17% share that they feel prepared. So in an often subconscious attempt to feel better about this lack of preparedness to meet the needs of students with disabilities, educators will often lean into a comfortable narrative about their skill gaps, which often leads to lowering expectations, as many of you have pointed out, for that student, or in some cases, even blaming or labeling that student as incapable. So this is just one example of how mindsets and skill sets work together to unfortunately present barriers to learning acceleration, specifically when it comes to students with learning and thinking differences. Now I want to actually transition to talking about another group of students, just so we can begin to make some more connections between our learning here and what we are currently seeing in our own schools as we plan for accelerated learning for all students. So we're going to take a look at how harmful mindsets and skill gaps can present barriers to accelerated learning for English learners, another population of students who can dramatically benefit from the learning acceleration approach. So English learners and their needs tend to be pushed to the margins of instruction for a variety of reasons, including biased mindsets, some of which we see here. These are some of the more common ones we hear, as well as skill sets. So some of these mindsets are directly tied to this gap in skill sets. So what I'd like you to do now is take a look at some of these statements you see here, and I'd like for you to chat the ones that you've heard most commonly in your career as an educator. So which of these problematic mindsets, most of which are tied to skill sets, have you most commonly heard? Please share in the chat. Seeing a lot of people sharing this sentiment of hearing about English learners not having support at home, or this misperception of that being true, not having language to participate. Generally, yes, I see we're acknowledging the deficit mindset that's coming through here. Only the English learning teacher is responsible. And of course, time is always an issue. So some of the challenges here have to do with how schools are organized to support English learners, but most of these can be traced back to underlying misconceptions having to do with a deficit orientation towards English learners, what assets they bring, and a lack of understanding how language develops. So the reality is that in an accelerated learning, the reality is that to accelerate learning for English learners, language and content must be addressed together and within context. So this means that all teachers hold a collective responsibility for the academic success of our English learners. And we'll be addressing that topic in a future session. But what is important here is understanding that when we do not attend to our needs to have common asset-based mindsets and developing those critical skill sets for our teachers, we are creating real barriers to student success, in particular, again, for our students who are most vulnerable. So while we may have a sense of what mindsets may be getting in the way of planning for accelerated learning for all students, or we may have an idea of what we think the skill sets are that need to be developed, it's worth investing time in hearing from different stakeholder groups to have a fuller picture of where you're starting to work in establishing common mindsets and developing critical skills to support accelerated learning. So within the roadmap, you'll find several tools that can support you with this task of identifying mindsets and skill sets, or I should say perceived mindsets and skill sets. So one tool is a resource from TNTP called the Learning Acceleration Survey, which you can find on page 9 of the roadmap. And among the areas the survey focuses on, you'll find questions around stakeholder groups' perceptions, around student belonging, equity and inclusion, progress monitoring, strong instruction, and so on, all of which are aligned to the priorities described in the roadmap itself. So the purpose of this survey is to gather data to drive learning acceleration efforts in your school. And while this survey should serve the needs of most schools, there may be some modifications you may need to make to it to fit your own context. Another tool that I'd like to introduce you to is this reflection tool, which can be found on page 15 of the roadmap. And I think of this reflection tool as a follow-up step once you have identified your starting point around mindsets and skill sets. So once you have identified your starting point, this tool supports you and your teams to think through and plan how you will challenge the assumptions that are creating barriers in ways that are productive and also lead to meaningful outcomes for students. So although we highly recommend that you complete this work with a diverse group of stakeholders, for the sake of the work we're doing today, we would like to provide you with the opportunity to begin some brainstorming around how you will establish common mindsets and identify skill gaps. So in your handout, you see these two questions. What are some of the existing mindsets and potential skill gaps associated with historically marginalized students that may exist in your school district or your school? And also think about the potential benefits if students with various learning needs are planned for from the outset. So before we thought about the consequences, now we want to think about what are the benefits for planning this way from the beginning. So right now, I'd like you to take about 2 minutes to just brainstorm on your own before we go into breakout groups. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and transition to breakout groups where you'll share some of your reflections around what are the current state around mindsets, potential skill gaps, and what you think the benefits are of planning from this way from the start. So you should be getting a message just in a moment.
In progress.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I'd like to ask one of my colleagues to share out on behalf of their group some of the thoughts you are hearing shared out.
I'd be happy to share, Irene.
Thank you.
In our group, we had a great discussion around skill gaps versus will gaps when it comes to acceleration, and about how, teachers are invested in the idea of acceleration, so maybe that will gap isn't quite there, but the skill gap is. So how can we be sure that we're really intentionally adding in professional development time and supporting teachers as they're, addressing acceleration in schools?
Great, thanks for sharing that out, Kristen. And one last point on this section is that after today's session, kind of piggybacking on what Kristen said, hopefully you will be going back to your schools and discussing what you've shared today with your teams. So thinking about how these mindsets and skill gaps or will gaps are manifesting in relation to the 3 priority areas that we have identified in the roadmap. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Thelma.
Okay, so we're going to continue in that vein and continue to explore a few tasks and tools that will support you in your understanding of your current state, and also looking at the existence of systems in your school and how we can start to think about the changes that we will begin to make. So, I want to just have you to think for a moment and think about this question. How do your existing systems and structures promote equity? And how do they promote inclusivity and collaboration in ways that support students? Today, you're going to begin to analyze your existing systems and structures through the lens of how they promote equity, inclusivity, and collaboration in ways that are guaranteed to support outcomes that are positive and ensure that students have positive experiences, all students. So for a moment, just think back to the key actions that were listed in the self-assessment in the leader roadmap and look at the priority areas. Think about the priority areas and focus for one, just one that you would like to focus on. So at this time, think about that particular one and think about the systems that are aligned to it according to your self-assessment. Maybe think about the one that needs the most attention at this point in your planning process. Perhaps it's not functioning the way that you would like for it to in order to consider the needs of our students. So as you examine this system more closely, in the next session for our planning, we're going to look at what changes need to occur in order to improve how this system is functioning. In a few minutes, we're going to look at an adaptation of an equity tool from the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium. This tool was designed to help you dig deeper into the equity that exists within your particular system. We're going to look through the lens of equity within the priorities and their aligned systems. So for just a moment, so take some time to select one priority area that you want to focus on for the next few minutes. For example, maybe you chose priority 1 and you wanted to focus there in your self-assessment. So you would look at priority 1, look at that section of the tool, and then look at the systems that are related there. For example, look at climate and culture. So as you think about that, let's think about what it requires for an equitable school. An equitable school provides climate, processes, and content that enable students and staff to perform at their highest capacity. An equitable school ensures successful academic outcomes by providing equitable resources and appropriate instructional strategies for each student. So now we're going to look at the consortium and we're going to think about the success criteria. We will review the criteria for equitable school systems, and then have you to think about gaps in your current system. Just think of this as a sample of a criteria for success. In your note catcher, which will be placed in the chat box for you again, you'll see in that note catcher, there are 3 tables that describe exactly what equity would look like in the 3 priority areas and their aligned systems. Please remember that as you explore these tables, this list is not comprehensive or all inclusive. It has just a list to help you get to thinking about what potential gaps may exist in your current system. It's not just exhausted here. So take a moment just to think about that. So for example, if I were using the tool, I could possibly think about priority 1 in a sense of belonging. And then of course, I would want to think about climate and culture. I would want to focus particularly on the system around climate and culture from my self-assessment. Hmm, I'm thinking that I probably would look at within the systems, my systems, for example, and decide where do I want to improve. I'm thinking about possibly looking at providing equitable access to my students and thinking about things that are happening in my classroom. I'm thinking about looking at the success criteria where I want to ensure that I'm avoiding self-segregation of my students. So I want to focus on maybe ensuring that there is class integration. So what I'm doing is thinking about my priority, thinking about the systems that are associated with it, and then looking at the tool to look at suggested criteria for success, because we're going to move in a few minutes to crafting a vision statement. And so these are just kind of some guiding things to help you start to think about what you would like to do. You're going to use your area that you chose and craft a vision statement and possibly a goal for the system that you would like to improve so that you can ensure that all of your students are supported through accelerated learning. I want to remind you that this table is not comprehensive and it is adapted from MAEC, and it's the criteria for equitable school audits. We recommend that you explore this tool thoroughly with your teams. For the purpose of this training, we're just simply drafting and generating a draft vision. So let's first think about this independently. And then after we think about it independently, we're going to actually draft a vision statement, and we'll have an opportunity in a few minutes to share those out. I'm going to walk through this for you just as an example and pretend to craft a vision statement. So I'm thinking about priority one at Perry Middle School. And there's a clear focus that I need to focus there. So I decided that I want my vision statement to be that all of my students will experience a sense of belonging by being socially and academically connected and respected and supported, and that there's a sense of trust among my staff and students. So as I'm thinking about that, I want to align my goals to my vision statement. But as I'm thinking about my goals, I want to make sure that I'm establishing measurable goals that I can track. So as I think about a potential goal, one that I'm going to suggest is that I know I can track the data from my emotional safety dimensions in the vocal survey. So that's a great place for me to start. So my goal is that 100% of the students at Perry Middle School will be able to report that they feel safe and that there's a positive bond at their school. So that's just an example of the kind of thinking that you're going to do for the next few minutes. So for the next 3 minutes, we're going to pause and give you some silent solo think time to capture your own vision and a goal statement on the note catcher. And then we'll have an opportunity to share out in our groups and get feedback from our colleagues. So it's okay if you go off video for the next 3 minutes. And at that time, you're going to think independently and privately using the tools that we've looked at to craft a vision statement and a goal statement.
We're going to revise that time and just give you about 60 seconds.
Thank you, Tabitha. So now that you had some think time to think about looking at the example that we see here, we're going to go into breakout rooms for a few minutes just for you to share your initial thinking. No worries, no pressure if you don't have it fully captured. This is just the opportunity to begin brainstorming on your vision and your goal for the priority area that you would like to improve. So in just a brief amount of time, you should see a message sending us the breakout rooms, and we're going to spend 3 minutes in our breakout rooms. Okay, so in my group, we had Jen who's gonna just take just about 30 seconds to share what connections she made with this tool and other tools.
Sure. So as I was looking through this tool, our group, really felt like it was helpful. And as I was looking through it, I kind of focused on priority one, school climate and culture is something I've been thinking about. And it reminded me of something I had in the pre-work we had done for this, and reading through all the different resources in that in the acceleration roadmap. Was linked under the aligned resources in terms of relationship mapping. And so I was just thinking about, making sure that, the vision being something along the lines of making sure that every student could identify at least one adult in the building that they felt connected to and really supported by, as we jump into, the accelerated learning and all of those pieces. And, the goal would probably be to dig into that relationship mapping resource and see what sort of system we might be able to put in place to do that at my school.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen, for representing Group 11 and sharing. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Irene.
Thanks everyone for your engagement thus far. We want to just very quickly acknowledge, we know this is moving at a very fast pace, and these are tasks that you are going to also need to go back and do with your team. So we're hoping that this gives you just a feel for what these tasks look like, what resources are available to you, and the kinds of conversations you're going to go back and have with your teams. We're hoping that you'll be able to take the questions from the handout and work through those together once you're back at your school setting. So we're going to keep moving, and in this last section, we're going to discuss how we can begin to operationalize the visions and goals that we've brainstormed through by strategically designing systems. So we really believe that your vision is only as good as your system. Tabitha, could I ask you to come off mute and read this quote to the group, please?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Every school leader has some sort of vision of the student culture he or she or they want to create, a mission or vision statement and/or an articulation of core values. What is noteworthy from looking at schools across the country, however, is that one realizes that having a vision or a set of school values was not a distinguishing factor of exceptional schools. What sets top leaders apart is that they transform their vision into meticulously built systems that operate across every single classroom.
Thanks, Tabitha. So we want you to be thinking about what this means for you as a school leader. Again, we strongly believe that a vision is only as good as the way that it's lived day to day through the systems that we create. So we really have to be intentional on focusing on systems, or we'll lose that vision. In this case, our vision tied to learning acceleration for all students. So leaders have a few levers that they can pull on in their schools to ensure that they can systematize change. So these levers impact teacher behaviors and thus impact student outcomes. We're going to very quickly discuss these levers before you have some independent time to think about how you will use them to support change in your own building. So we have 4 main inputs that you can control as a leader that impact the systems you choose to enact, whether they be around assessment and progress monitoring, climate and culture, and so forth. So first we have communicating expectations. What are the precise expectations of the adults in your building, and how will you communicate these? We have tools and structures. What are the tools that the adults will need to meet this vision for an expectation? Then we have supports, mainly thinking about what type of development opportunities will the adults in the building need to best implement the system. And then finally, time. What time will adults need in order to learn how to implement and also then refine along the way? So again, we're going to take a quick look at these levers or provide you with a bit of independent time to think through them. So, so far you have identified a system with Thelma that you have seen or believe is not currently functioning in a way that promotes equity. You've spent some time identifying potential gaps, looking at that success criteria in your handout, and hopefully you've begun to draft a vision statement for what the system should look like, and potentially you've created a goal around that. So now we want to think about what is our next step in relation to these levers that we have access to. So we're going to take let's take about 6 minutes for you to have some independent think time about these systems and structures that you've identified, possibly that even need to be dismantled as a way of promoting equity and equitable access to accelerated learning. As you're thinking about how you will address these levers, think about the potential barriers you also identified related to mindsets and skill sets that you'll need to address, and which lever will best address it. And then finally, remember that systems within a school, they're all interconnected. So as you create your plan, consider how the system aligns to the key action steps in the roadmap. So right now, we're going to take about 6 minutes for you to have that time to think through what is your next step following today as it relates to the system you've identified. If you have any questions, I know we're going to put those directions in the chat, but if you have any questions about these next steps, please feel free to ask in the chat. Just wanted to quickly simplify in the chat. So we're thinking about how we will use these levers to dismantle and overcome potential barriers to realizing systems that promote equity. So the system that you've chosen for today. And also, what is your next step? And we're going to ask for a few people to share what their next step is in a moment. So I know we're probably likely still brainstorming, but if you could, Tabitha has asked if you could share to please put your name in the chat so that we can call on you and we know that you're ready to share out what your ideas are for your next step following today's session. Thank you, Nora. Nora, would you mind coming off of mute and sharing with us what are some of your thoughts around your next steps to making sure we're providing equitable access to learning acceleration to all our students?
Sure. I got accepted onto we're a small alternative high school, and I got accepted onto our ILT team. I'm the special education teacher at the school. And so we've been working on our big rocks for what our professional development is going to be. And I feel like that this work, like our next step would be, how are we going to incorporate this into our professional development plan so teachers can get the support that they need?
Yes.
So that we, and including me, so that we can, make this work. And then also developing the vision. My principal, whatever vision she has for how this would work, figuring out how we're gonna make it happen.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Nora Davis.
Irene, we also have a response in the chat if you want to read that.
Sure. So from Jessica, thank you, Jessica, for sharing in the chat. It's a totally acceptable way to share as well. Jessica has shared that her action step is revisiting the PD calendar to consider how to incorporate more time for vertical data analysis across grade level bands. So similarly, returning to our PD calendars, thinking about how we're going to provide that professional development to our teachers to make sure that all students are being provided with that accelerated learning as opposed to remediation. Great, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Great. And Michelle, we'd love to hear from you.
So my priority is priority 3, the curriculum and instruction, and really sort of making sure that we are, my vision is around making sure that we provide all students access to grade level instruction and work. And so when I sort of looked at things, I kind of took it from 2 pieces. One, looking at it from like, let's dive back into the teacher rubric and look at that difference from proficient to exemplary, and that's where students sort of take on more of their learning, and that's the kind of learning that we want to have happen in our classrooms, those discussions, those, you know, thinking. And so looking at it from that piece, so we all have a really good definition of what is strong teaching, and then looking at it from the grade levels, including state rubrics and exemplars, so that we all have an understanding of what is it that kids need to be able to produce to meet these grade level standards, including discussions. Because I feel like that student talk is huge, and there's more teacher talk than student talk. So that's our big sort of focus with the expectations. Tools and structures, I feel like we have a lot of it there, but we need the time to be able to dive deep into it. And so for supports, we need, again, sort of the time to work through all of it and then plan how to put this into our instruction. And I think also looking at how we use data to inform our instruction, so that when we look at accelerating, we're looking at the data to build in our scaffolds and our supports.
Thank you for that great model, Michelle, of walking through all of those levers and how they are connected, as well as how our different systems are connected, even when we're just speaking about one priority. Really appreciate that example. And Claudine, if you can come up and share in about 60 seconds your plans for next steps, we'd appreciate that as well.
Sure, I'll speak very quickly. I think the next step is to really, I'm an assistant principal, so I would need to involve the principal, and we're also hiring a second assistant principal, and we're going to have a new coach in the building. So I feel like it really needs to be a team effort to really do some brainstorming and listing, you know, different things, and that will be really our map for the year. Fact is, we started to do that a little bit today. Just preliminary thoughts, but it really needs to be with other people. I feel like we shouldn't be on an island, you know, by ourselves. It won't work.
Absolutely. And exactly right. It will not work. Approaching it that way without full stakeholder feedback. And something we didn't talk as much about today, but when you look at that success criteria around equitable systems, we want to be thinking about who's at the table, who is involved, just as Claudine has shared, to make sure that we are being inclusive as we think through how to make these systems more equitable. So thank you so much to our volunteers who were brave and shared. I really think we benefit from this sharing of ideas. And we're going to begin to close out, and I'm going to pass it to one of my colleagues. I think Tabitha, you are going to close us out.
Thank you. Hi, everyone again. And thank you so much for coming, and it was so great to have you. And thank you for participating in the chat and in breakouts and out loud in the full group. Very much appreciated. We're going to be having 4 more sessions. They're up here on the deck. You can sign up via the link in the chat that Shirsa just shared. We would love to see you again. You know, in the last session, we had folks who attended every single one. We got very close with them. You know, we had our friends who came to every session. We'd love to see your face again. So please join us. We're also going to ask that you take a brief survey that is going to be shared in the chat right now. This survey is incredibly important. We're not going to be doing this PD session again, but we are thinking about what additional supports we might offer in the school year. And so we're kind of starting to think about that with Jessie. If you have ideas for how you can help bring learning acceleration alive in your building or district, super helpful for you to jot those down for us. We are reviewing those actively and thinking about how to actually build out some of the supports you're requesting, and, you know, just thinking about how to help you guys on the ground. So please go ahead and use the last 4 minutes that we have today to just click into that survey. You're welcome to go off video. You're welcome to stay on here and ask a question if you have a one-on-one, or just take the survey and log off, and we'll see you next time. But again, thank you so much, and please have an excellent afternoon. We're almost at the weekend, so have a great weekend. And again, I'm here if you have questions. The team is here if you have questions.